it's an improvement, but then again, the bar that 269 left was so incredibly low that calling this chapter an improvement isn't much of a ringing endorsement. Because yes, as you guessed it, I mean, you're the one who clicked on the video, chapter 270 of JJK is out. And it's not bad. It's rushed, it's choppy, but it's not bad. See, it seems though for some reason Gege is trying to fit in everything that everybody asked for in one chapter. Whether it's cleaning up what happened with Tengen, Takaba, Sukuna, or Megami's family, Gege decided, you know what? One chapter's good enough for all that. Just give everybody like 1.5 pages and then everybody will be super happy. Right? And like, not wrong, because yeah, a lot of the things that a lot of people have been complaining about in terms of lingering questions and plot holes have been answered by 270. However, the process in which it was done felt heavily rushed. And you can't help but wonder yourself as you're watching some of the most important questions in JJK get answered rather hastily. If we had instead taken, I don't know, 2 chapters and erased everything that we were forced to learn in chapter 269 and replaced it with an extended version of everything we learned in chapter 270, how much better these wrapped up events would have been received. But still, like I said, chapter 270 is a definitive improvement over chapter 269. I mean, sure, it introduces another plot point that's going to have to be resolved in chapter 271 as opposed to wrapping up all the other lingering plot lines, but it does manage to give us a pretty good still shot into what's going on in the JJK world post Sukuna and how that world is affecting pretty much all the individuals, and I mean all the individuals we've ever met in JJK. I mean, this chapter will make you go, oh my god, I forgot the guy existed about 6 times. And thus, while I'm not in love with the execution and the chapter is heavily confusing, Gege's got the right spirit. And sometimes that's the best we can hope for. But today we do have a lot to talk about. Whether it's checking in with Higuruma trying to balance being a lawyer and a jujutsu sorcerer, Amai trying to become decent, Tengen holding on to the barriers all across Japan, Megami checking in with his dead sister, Maki arming strangers, Charles making a one-shot manga, Takaba maybe bringing Geto back to life. But before we get into all that, today we need to talk about a brand new sponsor to the page, Manta Sleep. See, listen, rest is very important to me because I work very hard late. However, for some reason, at some point, my brain decided to stop being afraid of the darkness and decided, we can't sleep unless it's completely pitch black. And that's where face masks came into my life. Not only are they better for recovery of muscles if you're working out, but also just for getting a fuller night of sleep. And while for the longest time I used cheap face masks, Manta Sleep made me realize I was making the wrong move. See, the Manta Sleep mask is highly adjustable, which is good because we all have different sized heads, and I hate when my eyes feel pressure while I'm wearing a mask. On top of that, the quality of the materials used in the Manta Sleep mask is premium. But my favorite thing about the Manta Sleep mask, outside of the highly adjustable nature of it, is the fact that it has these eye cups. Like I said, there's no worse feeling than feeling the pressure of a face mask on your eyes, and therefore these eye cups make sure that never happens to you, instead applying pressure to your orbital bone. But this sleep mask doesn't end there, as the sleep mask also has Bluetooth headphones in the side, which are of course adjustable so it can slide directly over your ear. And thus, if you want to listen to white noise but your partner hates it, or if you like falling to sleep to music at night, the Manta Sleep mask is helping you out with that. With an intuitive and simple design to turn on your speakers and increase or decrease the volume, there's really no better sleep product on the market. So what are you guys waiting for? Follow the link in my description to get 10% off your Manta Sleep cart today, or use code WEEB10 for 10% off at checkout. Now, if you'll excuse me, I gotta catch up on a couple of Z's here. And therefore, we should get right on into it, because today we're talking chapter 270 of JJK Explained. Before we start explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I created with Stephen Heat, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you want to hear me talk anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, chapter 270 fortunately doesn't pick up where chapter 269 left off. It seems as though we're forgetting entirely about the new Shadow Style school debacle, and thank God for it. The chapter opens up with Shoko and Megami standing over a Fushiguro headstone, and Megami is telling Shoko, thank you so much. To which Shoko responds by saying, don't worry about it. And we see a blurb above Megami's head that says, praying for his sister's happiness in the afterlife, showing us that if it wasn't 100% confirmed that Megami's sister is dead, it now is. Shoko then chips in and says, even if all there's left to do is to burn it, cleaning up a body is always something worth doing. And this is obviously a reference to the fact that Shoko wasn't able to get her hands on Geto's body when he was killed, and if you didn't understand the subtlety there, don't worry. As Shoko continues on by saying, I'm happy if somebody can look pretty in the afterlife thanks to me. And it's at this point that she continues on by saying, and this is why I said you don't have to worry about the subtlety of what she said earlier, should have left Geto to me as well. What an idiot. Now the what an idiot part is in reference to Gojo. Megami responds to this by saying yes, and Shoko begins to talk to herself saying, well, it's not like I believe in the afterlife anyways, and starts laughing to herself, which very clearly either perturbs or scares Megami. We then on the next page see that Megami and Shoko are walking out of the graveyard, and Megami gets a call and goes, this is Fushiguro. Yes? I'll be right there. Then get a panel of what appears to be debris, and then below that panel appears to be something that's like cast in darkness, but I can't tell what it is because the scan quality isn't that high. But the important takeaway from these two panels is that Gaku Ganji, the president of Kyoto High and now the head of the Jujutsu Society, is telling us that among the remains that were ripped out of Megami lied Tengen, who had been absorbed by Sukuna and therefore by extension Megami. Now this answers where Tengen was. As the last time that we saw Tengen, he was in some kind of fetal position as it was being revealed that Sukuna was gaining access to his prior form. However, Tengen was only ever really shown in conjunction with Kenjaku, and therefore this answers the question, where was Tengen, who was using his abilities, and what happens to him now that Kenjaku and Sukuna are defeated? And the answer is not great for Tengen, but then again, Tengen's about the most useless person in this entire story, so I can live with that. It's revealed at this point that Gakuganji is talking to Utahime and Nita, but not Aratsunita, the guy who has the ability to put people in stasis, and the guy who saved Nobara's life, and I guess also Yuta's life, Akari Nita, his older sister, who's an auxiliary manager. Now Utahime, who in response to hearing that Tengen was ripped out of Megami and now exists among Sukuna's remains, says, but then Tengen's barriers all across Japan will be ... To which Gakuganji responds by saying, by placing in Sukuna's remains, the barriers will remain a little bit longer. Now this is a bit odd, not from like a plot perspective or anything like that, but like surely based off the fact that this is implying that in some capacity or another, Sukuna's remains are still alive. That is to say that even if just the extension of Sukuna's remains, that is Tengen, remain alive and have cursed energy that can manipulate Tengen's barriers, this still feels like in some way or another Sukuna, or maybe just Tengen's cursed energy, is still kicking. Now for those of you who are trying to remember why Tengen's barriers are so important, well, there's actually a lot of reasons that Tengen's barriers are so important. See, the barriers that Tengen maintains around Jujutsu High keep it out of the eye of general purview. It changes the appearance and the layout of the buildings every single day to make sure that only the people who know specifically how to get to Jujutsu High are able to get there. And these aren't the only concealing barriers that Tengen maintains, as Tengen also maintains the barrier around the Tomb of the Stars corridor's entrance, and he maintains the anonymity of the Tomb of the Stars by making the barrier thousands of shuffling doors. I apologize. Tengen is a she. Well, kind of. Tengen is more a cursed spirit than anything nowadays, but they started as a she. And amongst these thousands of shuffling doors are A, Tengen's actual location, and B, the warehouse where Jujutsu High holds all of its cursed objects and cursed weapons. On top of this, Tengen maintains a series of pure barriers across Japan that raise Tengen's cursed spirit suppression abilities and the barrier techniques cast by assistant managers that are assigned to Jujutsu Highs. And these four barriers exist at the Imperial Palace, the Tomb of the Stars, the Yamakuni Mausoleum, and Mount Hida. So all in all, Tengen's barriers are very important, which is why everybody was wondering where Tengen is and what this means for the future of JJK, them possibly not being around. Now, upon Gakuganji revealing to Nita and Utahime that simply by placing Sukuna's remains inside of the Tomb of the Stars that the barrier should be maintained for at least a little while, Utahime says we need to immediately come up with a strategy and general plan. To which Gakuganji responds by saying, don't be so hasty, everyone's still young, implying that the problem of the barriers crashing down is not an immediate one. He follows this up by saying everything is fine. We then cut to Maki, who's throwing a katana at somebody you haven't seen in a very, very long time. You guys guys remember Hagane Daido? What do you mean you don't remember Hagane Daido, the main character of JJK? The reincarnated sorcerer of a nameless swordsman? The Culling Games participant, the swordsman who helped Maki in the battle against Cursed Naoya, the guy who borrowed Maki's replica of the split soul katana. Come on, you remember Hagane. Well, if you don't remember Hagane, Hagane remembers you, and remembers how cool swords are. Because when Hagane catches this katana thrown at him by Maki, he freaks out and goes, "Katana! A cursed one, too." And it's at this point that Maki says something, and this could be because of poor translations, that perplexes me a little bit. Maki says the Culling Games no longer functions. This is, and I'm going to read this verbatim, this is probably because the incarnated type of players are taking steps together. Now, I'm assuming what Maki is saying here is that the Culling Game is over, and the reason that the Culling Game is over is because the reincarnated sorcerers are working together to possibly take out cursed spirits, or just live. Basically, Maki is telling all of us that the Culling Games are over. Whether the Culling Games ended with the death of Kenjaku, Sukuna, or just because everyone started working together, something happened that made the Culling Games end. And therefore, you won't get points from cutting down other Culling Game participants, or even points from excising cursed spirits. And thus, Maki, in this moment, I think is essentially telling Hagane to go live. Maki then hammers down this point by saying Megami managed to come back alive. It's a gamble, but it's pretty much certain that they, and by they, I'm assuming Maki means the Jujutsu Society, are going to move forward with Yuji and Hana, pulling the cursed items from the victims. And I believe what Maki is referencing here is the reincarnated sorcerers as the victims. Because for those of you who don't remember, the way that the reincarnated sorcerers were made is that Kenjaku made deals with people over the last 1,000 years that he would reincarnate them into the Culling Games, and he made different people vessels for those reincarnations by feeding them cursed objects. He then, after breaking a piece of paper at the Culling Games, invited all of the souls of the people he said he would reincarnate into those people through the medium of the cursed objects he placed in them. And therefore what Maki is telling us here is that Hana and Yuji are going to be extracting those cursed objects from all of the reincarnated sorcerers, which would in essence essentially bring back the people who were turned into the reincarnated sorcerers, kind of like how Megami is back now after turning into Sukuna. See, for a long time the separation wasn't thought possible, but now that's been proved that it could happen with Megami, the Jujutsu Society and probably Gakuganji are moving forward with getting rid of the reincarnated sorcerers and giving the people who had the cursed objects placed in them their lives back. Because mind you, while we have Hagane now, we don't have the person that Hagane took over. Now, this doesn't apply to the people who awoke to cursed energy, like Higuruma, because their participation in the Culling Games was based off the fact that they had the brain to maintain cursed energy, but never got it for some reason. They're different from the reincarnated sorcerers. Maki then goes on to say, through the added rules, we're also going to go get all the players who were taken by the American Army. And this is kind of weird. See, because here's the thing. While this conversation that Maki is having is not only revealing to us that Hagane and Mio, the sumo guy, are still alive, and therefore that they would have needed to die before the merger was ever initiated, but Maki seems to be implying that sometime during the Culling Games, the American Army kidnapped some of the players, which would seem to imply that we were substantially further away from the merger than we ever thought we were. Because, well, yes, it's absolutely a possibility that the American Army came in to reconstruct Tokyo like we've done before, and it was during that time that the American Army decided to kidnap a couple of Jujutsu sorcerers, but we can't necessarily say either of those scenarios are the situation because that's all the information we get on the American Army kidnapping sorcerers. And therefore, if the rules for initiating the merger were all Culling Game participants need to die outside of Kenjaku and Megami, and some of the Culling Game participants were in America, the merger was never gonna happen, which kind of makes the whole plan feel a little silly. But for the sake of Kenjaku still seeming like a smart person, let's say that the Americans didn't kidnap the sorcerers until after Sukuna's death. Maki goes on to say, even though you aren't antagonistic, you're no exception to the rule. And what she's saying here is essentially that even though you as reincarnated sorcerers are good people, that doesn't mean that we won't rip the cursed object out of you. Maki continues by saying, I'm talking to myself here, but even though the Culling Games are over, Tokyo is still a very dangerous place. The existence of cursed spirits was announced as something that only happens inside of Tokyo. And yet curses continue to gather all across the country. And therefore, if I was a reincarnated sorcerer who the Jujutsu Society was actively trying to kill, I would hide in the countryside. Takane responds to this by saying, yes, there's plenty of things to cut down. Actually, Maki here says that Tokyo is an inviolable area, which means that it's like heavily defensible. I mean, inviolable means secure from assault or trespass. So maybe she's telling them to hide in Tokyo? But anyways, regardless of where they're gonna be hiding, Mio is upset about it. As he says, I don't like it. Sumo with cursed spirits is boring. And if you guys don't remember who Mio is, he's the guy who's always with Hagane, who's the sumo enthusiast. enthusiast. You can make a simple domain if both people agreed to a sumo match. Come on, the deuterogonist of JJK, Mio. Maki responds to Mio talking about how sumo is boring against cursed spirits by saying, do what you want. This is all I can do to cover for you guys. Now, get lost, scram, shoo. And when Hagane is going to leave, he says, when it's time to erase me, Maki, you should come. I'll cut you down. To which Maki responds to with a laugh. We then check in with Charles, who's probably got his ribs back. Rika ate his ribs so that Yuta could use G Warstaff, which is Charles' curse technique. And Charles is saying to himself or his editor that print magazines should still remain. That way the creator can receive feedback on how the print quality affects the story. And it's like, okay, Gege, I don't know if you're trying to push some kind of manga political agenda here through Charles, but okay. Charles then continues on talking to himself or his editor by saying out loud that newbies should at least experience working beside a veteran once in their career. To which his editor responds by saying, you did have a bad experience from that after all. Oh, I just remembered because I've been talking about Charles now for longer than 30 seconds, which is something new to me. The reason that Charles is like, we should never stop printing manga is because after the Shibuya incident, they stopped printing manga in Japan. And the veteran creator that Charles is talking about is Hikari, who encouraged Charles to continue being a mangaka after defeating him in the Culling games. Charles then quips back to his editor saying, I'm a mangaka whose art sucks. And the editor tells him to hurry up, telling him that the printers aren't going to wait for a newbie's one-shot. To which Charles responds by saying, even the veterans shouldn't be waited on. Once again, I don't know if Charles is supposed to be some kind of OC insert from Gege, or if this is just supposed to be Charles showing growth as he was just like a regular otaku trying to brute force his way into manga prior to his fight with Hikari. But it's a weird... It's a weird addition. But speaking of weird additions, Takaba's alive, which makes sense. He didn't incur any damage in the battle against Kenjaku, and everybody who was like, oh yeah, but he killed himself because he was so happy, it felt a bit silly. And oh yeah, also Kenjaku might be alive. What do I mean by that? Well, let's unpack it. But before we get into any of that, did any of you guys miss those couple of chapters when there was Japanese joke on Japanese joke on Japanese joke that none of the American audience understood even in the slightest? Back when Takaba was battling against Kenjaku. No, you didn't miss that? Of course. Why would you? It was heavily confusing. Well, welcome back to that, because Takaba's having a conversation with somebody whose face we don't see. And rather interestingly, both him and this person are dressed the exact same. Now, Takaba's telling this person, so that's why having a lot of dirty jokes is good, you see? Well, let's keep away from erotic jokes. Even though they're also dirty jokes, it's better to stick with dirty jokes that are about poop and pee, like Pyun Pyun Maru and Hatori-kun. Now, Pyun Pyun Maru is an anime that aired in 1967 in Japan. And Hatori-kun, also known as Ninja Hatori-kun, was a child's anime about Hattori Hanzo that aired from 1964 to 1968. And since Takaba is supposed to be a blast from the past, a person whose comedic routine is heavily rooted in 60s Japan, these references make perfect sense. Now, the person whose face we can't see says, so they're basically the same thing. And Takaba responds by saying they're completely different. Were you not listening? But Takaba says, enough about this, let's go practice our routines. And the mystery person says, can you not say practice our routines in a loud voice? Now, Takaba and this mystery person, whose hair and body looks exactly like that of Geto and or Kenjaku's, then start to leave the restaurant that they were sitting in. And Takaba is telling this mystery person at least pay today. He then says, practicing our routines is not a dirty joke. And even the translator here is kind of confused on what the humor is supposed to be. And that's just dealing with Takaba. And that's it. That's all that we get from Takaba and maybe Geto. Do you understand how wild that is? There are two panels where the mystery person exists. One of them, a windowsill, blocks their face, and in the other, Takaba's word blur blocks their face. However, in the second panel, it's very clearly Geto's hairstyle, and thus a couple of things could have happened. One, Takaba could have realized he needed a partner and would have thought it funny if his partner looked like Geto or Kenjaku. Or two, Takaba realized that him and Kenjaku were so funny together that it would be funny if Kenjaku came back to life as his comedic partner. Now, mind you, Takaba can do anything, and I mean anything with cursed energy so long as he thinks it's funny. And since Takaba did find Kenjaku hilarious, something that he would think would be funny is him and Kenjaku as comedy partners. And therefore it is 1000% within the realm of possibility that either Geto or Kenjaku is back alive as Takaba's comedy partner. However, since it was Kenjaku that found Takaba funny and entertaining, it's most likely Kenjaku. But they are in Geto's body, which, mind you, once again, again was not taken care of by Shoko. And therefore, while many people believe that what Shoko was referencing in the first couple of pages of this chapter was the time that Shoko didn't take care of Geto's body after Gojo killed him, this also could have been a two-sided reference to the fact that Geto's body was once again not taken care of after the conclusion of Yuta chopping off his head. But to that you might be saying, but Nick, didn't Yuta feed the entirety of Kenjaku's body to Rika? Well, maybe, but it was also never revealed how much of Kenjaku's body Rika ate. And also there's a fair to solid possibility that Takaba doesn't even need Kenjaku's body to physically exist. He can do anything he wants so long as he finds it funny, which means he could probably just materialize Kenjaku if he wanted to. But enough about the key villain of the entirety of the manga possibly being brought back as a comedic duo to a side character. We gotta see Amai apologize to a character whose name is quite literally Fatty Bumbaddy. You know, Amai, the guy who went to school with Yuji who can make sugar with his hands. And in this page, Amai is apologizing for bullying Fatty Bumbaddy. At least that's what the translator says their name is. I genuinely can't find what their name is, for bullying him in high school and probably calling him Fatty Bumbaddy. Amai then bows his head to this child he bullied, and the child he bullied gives him a scowl, running off without forgiving Amai. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, Amai and Fatty Bumbaddy got 2.5 pages when Takaba and maybe Kenjaku got 1. Yeah, the guy who makes flan with his hands apologizing to a kid he bullied 100 chapters ago, maybe 200 chapters ago, got more screen time than Takaba, the literal god of this universe and the main antagonist of the story. But Amai, upon realizing that he hasn't been forgiven, says, man, I just want to be decent. We then check in with Higuruma, who appears to be having a conversation with a female lawyer who probably works at a similar firm to his, as she's telling Higuruma they're not prosecuting you. Now, more likely than not, this is probably in reference to the fact that Higuruma killed like a lot of people during the Culling games. Like, a lot of people. But so far as he saw it, they were all criminals, and therefore he was acting as a vigilante. Now, Higuruma tells this other lawyer that the reason that he's probably not being prosecuted is because they're getting pressure from the headquarters. Headquarters being Jujutsu headquarters. Higuruma follows this up by saying, it would seem they want me to work hard as a sorcerer, and he can't do that if he's behind bars for multiple murders. At this point that Higuruma says, I'm sorry, what's next is ... And the other lawyer says, starting over, right? I'll push forward, Higuruma-san, as the representative of the bereaved family. Now, I have no idea what this means, but I'm assuming that the woman that he's talking to is the lawyer of the families that Higuruma killed, but because Higuruma isn't going to be prosecuted because he's an important sorcerer, she has to act as the representative of the bereaved family and stop them from prosecuting him. I genuinely don't know. All that's being revealed here is that Higuruma's not going to jail and that he's going to be a sorcerer. Easy as that. We'll then cut to Angel and Hana, who are apparently not going to be separated because they are needed to separate all the other reincarnated sorcerers. And Angel is talking to Megumi, saying Sukuna using a method like that means that he probably already dug up memories about Hana from within Megumi. Now, what I believe Angel is talking about here is when Sukuna screamed out that Hana/Angel was killing Megumi when they hit him with the first Jacob's Ladder. The Jacob's Ladder that actually worked against him, as opposed to the other 4. Angel says, well, there's nothing to be embarrassed about at this point, but Hana responds by telling Angel to shut up. Now, Megumi, kind of maladroitly, says, I will take responsibility. I will become Hana's right arm from now on. Now, this sounds a lot like Megumi saying that he's gonna marry Hana, and Megumi, as our resident boy kisser, obviously doesn't understand this. So when Hana responds by clasping her hands over her face and saying, when shall we do the ceremony, Megumi, very awkwardly and very choppily, says, and I quote, not in that way, I have a mission, let's talk later. Which leads Hana to think to herself, I was too hasty, his speech was all broken up. Now this seems to imply that Megumi and Hana are gonna end up together, if the community is wrong about Megumi being a boy kisser. Well, the community and Toto. But also, didn't they say that Hana could get her arm back at any time? They're like, oh, Yuta only needs to hold on to the arm for a certain amount of time so that you can use the technique in the battle against Sukuna. But they promised that Hana would get her right arm back and that Charles would get his ribs back. So Megumi shouldn't have to be Hana's right arm. She should be her own right arm. Anyways, enough epiloguing. We need to introduce in the second to last chapter an entirely new plot line. And we're gonna do that by showing a woman walking into her apartment and saying, hey, I'm home. The lights were left on in the hallway. And then asking the person who appears to be either her husband or boyfriend, do you want to go out to dinner tonight? But when her boyfriend turns around to her and says, oh, Sounds good. He's got the biggest, doughiest, old school anime style eyes you've ever seen in your entire life. He then asks his girlfriend if she wants to go to Yakiniku. We then see Ichichi, who survived the battle against Sukuna, even though Gojo pulled him into what was the most dangerous place on Earth for an afternoon, as he's reading out a note to the rest of Team Gojo that says, the victim is Fukazawa Sota. He's 26 years old, and according to his fiance who's living with him, his face changed ever since about 2 weeks ago. We then see Team Gojo meeting the soon-to-be newlyweds, and Megami is asking Yuji, how does it look? To which Yuji responds by saying, like a normal pro wrestling trainee. He then goes over to the dude whose eyes are supposed to be the size of dinner plates and starts feeling him up, telling him he's got a great body and asking him what he does. To which the guy whose eyes are supposed to be the size of dinner plates says, well, I wrestled until high school. It's then revealed as Team Gojo sees him as a regular human being that the person who's actually cursed is the girlfriend or the fiance. It's hazy. And this is very surprising to her because she thought that his face was permanently mangled, but in actuality, she's just perceiving him incorrectly. Megami then asks Nobara to go check out the woman. So Nobara does a body check on her to see if she's cursed. Yuji then tells us that according to Ichichi, the amount of cursed energy residue could really only ever amount to bad vibes. And thus Megami responds by saying there's a low chance of it being a cursed spirit. Yuji responds with, really? And Megami continues on by saying she's not haunted by a cursed spirit, and yet the residue and atmosphere and changes are only at an annoyance level, which leads Megami to the conclusion that it's probably a curse user. But Megami goes on to say, even then, there's no feeling of murderous intent, so I think it might be one of the surviving Culling Games players, one of the awakened types. Of course, a semi-first grade spirit has thoughts and the ability to hold back, and there are patterns that they can lay down early to increase the damages later, like with the Yasobachi Bridge, so we can't entirely reject the notion that what's going on with her isn't malignant. Now, what Megami is referring to with the Yasobachi Bridge is the finger bearer that was luring people to the bridge and then killing them once they got there. But the process of luring people to Yasobachi Bridge and making it seem haunted and making people do honor tests to dive across it wasn't necessarily malignant. It's what would happen if you were pulled into the finger bearer's domain that was. Yuji then comes to the conclusion that it's probably just harassment from a cursed user, and with the three of them, beating any cursed user would be pretty simple. And like, yeah, I'd say so. You got a special grade sorcerer in Yuji and undoubtedly 2 first grade sorcerers, borderline special grade sorcerers in Nobara and Megami. So battling against anybody should be relatively easy. Unless, of course, Megami is right. See, because if the person harassing all of these people is an awakened type Culling game participant, there's not a whole lot of those left. In fact, so far as we know, amongst people that are still alive are Rin, Charles, Takaba, and Higuruma. The rest are either dead or reincarnation types. And of those 4 people, who do you think would make a boyfriend's eyes seem massive to only their fiance? It's not Charles. It's not Higuruma. It's not Rin. In fact, out of those 4 people, there's only one person who has the ability to even pull off that feat in the first place, and that's Takaba. The very same Takaba who only got 1 page in this second to last chapter. The very same Takaba who might have Kenjaku as a partner. If I had to put my money on Megami possibly being right, an awakened typed Culling Games player turning somebody's eyes massive so that only their fiance could see it, yeah, I'd put my money on Takaba. And as Takaba is quite literally the god of this universe, so long as he finds whatever he's doing funny enough, I'd say that while Team Gojo stands a better than fair chance against any other curse user on Earth right now, Takaba may be the exception to that rule. And therefore, in my optimistic little brain, I'm hoping that the only reason that we only got 1 page from Takaba is that we're about to get an entire chapter about Takaba and possibly Kenjaku. Because the last thing that we got from chapter 270 was a series of blurbs that told us the next issue is the last chapter, the last mission, Itadori and Co. versus the harassing curse user. And here's the thing, Takaba still being alive is massive for this story. If Takaba found it funny enough that he was able to reincarnate Kenjaku, the last chapter quite literally gives us infinite possibilities for what could happen. And as 1000% berserk as this sounds, one of those possibilities could be Gojo coming back. Now, I'm not rooting for Gojo coming back. My God, he's been back. In fact, I think he plays a bigger part in the story after his death. But if this story ends with Gojo coming back because Takaba thought it would be funny to bring Kenjaku and Gojo back together, my God, what an ending that would be. And so I'm not necessarily rooting for that ending. I am rooting for a classic Takaba mess around in the final chapter of JJK that either completely uproots everything that we knew about this manga or gives us a couple of characters back. But then again, the final chapter could have nothing to do with Takaba. And if it does have something to do with Takaba, I believe we stand a better chance of getting a sequel than if it doesn't have anything to do with Takaba. But here's the thing. This chapter did not bode well for those of you who wanted a sequel. While yes, chapter 269 seemed to leave some open-ended notes about possibly the Kamo and Gojo families clashing and the new Shadow Style School being the third faction in that war, this chapter seemed much more like an epilogue, a chapter that was meant to close a story out. And therefore, if you're trying to buy stock in Jujutsu Kaisen, I genuinely think chapter 270 probably tanked that stock price. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. After reading chapter 270, do you believe there'll be a Jujutsu Kaisen? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Oh, man, you can't say that you don't want Takaba to be like, oh, it was all a dream in 271 and just destroy everything that JJK has ever built. That would be legendary.